My son and I drove my wife to the airport for a business trip. On the way back, the boy hesitated, then said, "Dad, I saw Mom talking to a strange man." I brushed it off immediately. The woman who had shared my bed for so many years. How could that be possible? I even thought the boy didn't like his stepmother and had imagined it. But then he spoke very specifically. What time, where it happened, and the camera being turned off. Finally, he looked straight at me and said one sentence that sent a chill down my spine. "If you go home tonight, Dad, you might die." And for the first time in my life, I chose to believe my child. If you're listening up to this point, leave a dot and tell me where you're listening from. One subscription from you will give me the courage to keep telling this story to the end. My name is Nathan, and I am 48 years old. The woman sitting beside me that afternoon was Mary Ann, my wife, and the stepmother of the boy, Elliot, 9 years old. We took Mary Ann to Logan Airport on a late weekend afternoon. Boston cold in that familiar way of days about to change seasons. The road into the departure lane was busy, but manageable, and cars lined up without chaos. Mary Ann sat in the passenger seat, fingers quickly scrolling through emails on her phone, her face focused, exactly like someone about to step into a short business trip. She talked about clients, about meeting schedules, and about video calling home tomorrow night. Everything sounded fine, smooth, without a single ripple to doubt. Elliot sat in the back, silent. My 9-year-old son was thin, with eyes that tended to linger longer than other people's on things that seemed ordinary. Elliot was my child from a previous marriage that had ended many years ago. When I married Mary Ann, he was only 6. He started calling Mary Ann Mom very early, not because anyone forced him, but because he wanted this house to look like a normal family. Elliot didn't ask how many days Mary Ann would be gone, didn't mention souvenirs. He just sat there, both hands on his backpack, fingers tracing the zipper as if checking something again and again to be sure. I used to think that silence was how a child from a previous marriage kept himself neat and unobtrusive in a family with a new adult. When the car stopped at the drop-off lane, Mary Ann leaned over and kissed my cheek, a familiar, quick touch, nothing excessive. She turned to Elliot, reminded him to eat dinner on time and to brush his teeth. Her voice was gentle, proper, the kind of tone of a woman always trying to fulfill her role rather than truly live in it. Elliot nodded, still not looking up. Mary Ann opened the door, pulled down her suitcase, her steps decisive as she blended into the flow of people passing through the sliding glass doors. I watched until her hair completely disappeared among the dark coats. I started the engine, getting ready to pull away. That was the moment Elliot leaned forward and grabbed my hand. It wasn't a careless, childlike touch. His small hand tightened, fingers curling with enough force that I could clearly feel the trembling travel up my arm. "Dad," he said, his voice low but urgent, "don't go home tonight." I glanced at the rearview mirror. Elliot's face had gone pale, his lips pressed tight, his eyes wider than usual. A familiar thought crossed my mind, the kind a busy father defaults to. Maybe he was anxious because Mary Ann was leaving, or because of that lingering insecurity of a child who had already lost his biological mother once in his life. I was about to laugh it off, about to say something reassuring, but Elliot didn't stop. "Mom isn't going anywhere," he continued, "at least not the way she said." I eased onto the brake and pulled the car over, away from the drop-off lane. My heart jumped a beat. I turned fully to face my son. "What are you talking about, Elliot?" He swallowed, took a deep breath, like someone about to recite something he'd rehearsed for a long time. "Mom made a call at 7:15 last night, not to a client. I heard the man's name. She said tonight they would come to the house after 10. I felt a chill run lightly down my spine. I work as an industrial safety manager for a chemical corporation. My job revolves around separating speculation from data. I'm used to reports that log hours, minutes, and locations. Elliot had just given me a timestamp. "Were you eavesdropping?" I asked. keeping my voice as even as I could. Elliot shook his head. I went to get water. Mom was in her office, the door closed but not locked. She thought I was already asleep. He said, "Mom," naturally, but I heard no intimacy in it, only a habit practiced over time. I stayed silent. Marianne's office was a space she rarely let anyone into, including me. I had always assumed it was just the habit of a financial consultant, needing privacy to handle documents. I had never asked myself whether that privacy also meant keeping Elliot out. "Did you hear anything else?" I asked. Elliot looked out the window where luggage carts rolled past. Mom said she'd leave the key in the old place. She said not to make noise because Dad stays up late. Then she turned off the garage camera. I saw her do it on the computer. Each sentence fell from Elliot steadily, not rushed, not jumbled. He wasn't telling the story the way children exaggerate. He was listing details, the same way I list risks in emergency meetings. I heard the name of a specific action, turning off the camera. I heard a location, the garage. I heard an adjustment was made to avoid attention. "Are you sure?" I asked, even as discomfort had already begun to stir inside me. Maybe Mom was just talking about work. Elliot turned back to me. The look in his eyes made me look away. There were no tears, no panic, just something deeply serious, far older than his age. "Dad," he said slowly, "I'm not scared. I just know. Mom hid a bag in the trunk, a gray bag. She said not to let Dad see it." He paused, then added very softly, "Mom thinks I don't notice." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. An image flashed in my mind of Marianne opening the trunk that morning, carefully placing her suitcase inside, covering something in the corner with a jacket. At the time, I hadn't paid attention. I had been thinking about tomorrow's meeting, about a risk assessment due. "What do you think they're going to do?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Elliot shook his head. "I don't know, but Mom said if everything happens at night, it'll be faster." He used the exact word Marianne had used. No more, no less. No further explanation was needed. I've worked around accidents long enough to understand what faster means when it's used in connection with things that can cause harm. I remembered training sessions where they taught that the most dangerous part of an incident isn't the fire itself, but the first minutes when people haven't had time to react. I sat there with the car parked on the shoulder, Logan Airport still noisy ahead of us, while inside my head a clear fork in the road appeared. One path was habit, drive my son home, dismiss what I'd just heard as a child's anxiety, continue the familiar life. The other was trusting a child who had learned to observe adults, to protect himself, acting on fragments of information gathered in silence. I've taught my teams that the greatest risks come from ignoring small signals because they disrupt the schedule. I've signed reports ordering production shutdowns over a single unresolved detail. But at home, with my son, especially when he wasn't the shared child of this marriage, I'd often chosen the easier path. Reassure, smooth things over, ignore. I looked back at Elliot. His hand was still on mine, the pressure unchanged. He wasn't begging. He was waiting for a decision. "All right," I said quietly. "I believe you." Elliot let out a long breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding. His shoulders sagged, but his eyes remained tense. "We're not going home," I continued. "At least not tonight." I pulled the car back into traffic, merging with the flow, leaving the airport. The taillights ahead stretched into long red streaks. I didn't know what I had just avoided, or how high the cost of this decision would be. I only knew one thing. For the first time, I chose to stand with my own child, instead of trying to keep my second marriage looking normal. And I had no idea that choice was about to open the door to a truth far more brutal than I could have imagined. On the drive away from the airport, I didn't turn on the radio. I left the silence so my mind could talk to itself. Elliot sat in the back seat, leaning against the seat, both arms wrapped around his backpack. The familiar, Roads suddenly felt longer than usual, as if every curve dragged along an old memory I had tried to tuck into a dark corner. Those signs didn't appear all at once. They fell sporadically, scattered, like fragments I brushed aside because I believed I was building a second family that needed calm more than suspicion. I remembered the evening Elliot said there was a strange car parked near the house. He showed me the spot very clearly, right at the corner under the yellow streetlight. I looked outside and saw an old pickup truck. I laughed, ruffled his hair, and told him people in this neighborhood parked all the time temporarily. In my mind, it was the defensive instinct of a child who had been through divorce, used to being alert. I gave myself the right to explain things away for him, then closed the subject. Then there was Marianne's home office. The door was always shut, the latch clicking softly but decisively. I had stood in front of it before, my hand on the doorknob, then pulled back. I told myself everyone needed private space. I went further, convincing myself that Marianne had never seen Elliot as her own child, and that her distance was probably her way of protecting herself. That was far more comfortable than admitting an invisible wall was being built right inside our home. The security cameras would occasionally malfunction. Some days the signal dropped for hours. Other days the garage angle was darker than usual. Elliot noticed before I did. He asked why the image stuttered, why the infrared light didn't turn on. I brushed it off, saying electronics were glitchy, especially older installations. I even scolded him for being overly sensitive, saying that growing up without his biological mother made him prone to worrying. That sentence still leaves my throat dry to this day. What did I do with those pieces? I gathered them, labeled them small things, and set them aside. I was busy. I wanted this family to look like a normal family. I spoke for Marianne in the rare moments Elliot asked why she was often irritable or avoidant. I told him adults had their own pressures. I used work as a shield, staying late, coming home late, so I wouldn't have to face the quiet tension between my second wife and my son. Those memories ran parallel with the streetlights sliding past the car window. I drove, hands steady on the steering wheel, but it felt like I was sliding across a surface with no grip. Each memory that surfaced dragged along a question. If I had paused longer back then, if I had asked more carefully, would tonight be different? Elliot stayed silent. I thought about speaking, then stopped. Some things, once spoken, can never return to how they were. I waited until he spoke first. He lifted his head, his voice small but clear. "Dad," I answered without turning around. "Yeah." "I think Mom is preparing to make you disappear." He paused for a beat. "Then me?" I pressed the brake lightly, the car slowing. That sentence carried no fear in its tone. It sounded like a conclusion drawn after connecting data points. I heard in it the coldness of a child who understands he is not part of an adult's plan. I didn't ask him what he based that on. I already knew the answer. It lay in the signs I had ignored, in the way I kept justifying the adults, in my choice of surface-level peace over truly listening. The car kept moving. I saw clearly something I had never dared to name before. Betrayal doesn't begin with fire or violence. It is born in awareness when someone realizes they've been excluded from the circle of care. For Elliot, that coldness arrived before any tangible danger. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. From that moment on, I knew I no longer had the right to call any sign a small thing. And I understood that the cost of realizing too late could be greater than any professional mistake I had ever made. I turned off the familiar route that led back to the neighborhood, slowing the car as if I were looking for a temporary parking spot. Elliot did not ask anything. He just stared straight ahead, hands resting quietly on his thighs, carrying the composure of a child already accustomed to keeping what he knew to himself until adults were ready to listen. I chose the empty lot across from the house. It used to be a staging area for construction materials. Now only cracked concrete and a few traffic light poles remain. I parked at the edge of the shadows, far enough not to draw attention, close enough to clearly see the front door and the garage entrance. I pulled my hood up, lowered the seat, and shut off the central display completely, so from the outside, it looked like nothing more than a car parked overnight. I knew the area had public cameras, their angles covering the entire stretch of road in front of the house. In my line of work, I had learned to wait for evidence rather than act on emotion. Tonight, that patience became a condition for survival. I turned off the engine but did not open the door. Inside the cabin, the air grew heavy. Elliot shifted closer and lowered his voice, as if afraid someone might hear. "They'll come after 10 o'clock, he said. Mom said so." I checked the time. 9:20. 40 minutes left. I nodded without asking more. That statement was too specific to be dismissed as intuition. I pulled the handbrake and adjusted the seat so Elliot could lie more comfortably. He used his backpack as a pillow, eyes still fixed on the house ahead, where the living room light glowed steadily as it did every night. Time dragged. I could hear every small sound clearly. Wind brushing through dry grass, distant cars passing, metal contracting as the temperature dropped. Each minute stretched out, as if the whole neighborhood were holding its breath with us. 5 minutes to 10. Elliot stirred and pointed toward the end of the street. "Soon," he said, his voice steadier than I expected. At 10:10, a service truck appeared. The body was smooth, no logo, dark paint hard to distinguish under the streetlights. It slowed, then stopped directly in front of my house. No hazard lights. The precision of the parking told me the driver knew exactly where he needed to be. 2 men stepped out, dark jackets, hoods pulled low. They did not glance around for neighbors, did not hesitate at the door. I could see the familiarity in every movement. No one carried a crowbar or lock-breaking tools. One of them went straight to the garage. He stopped at the exact spot where Marianne always kept the spare key, just as Elliot had told me in the car. I held my breath as the garage door opened. No metal clatter, only the smooth motion of a door that had been prepared in advance. The other man crouched and opened a small box mounted on the wall. I recognized it immediately. The lockbox. I had installed it last year in case Elliot forgot his key when coming home early from school. I had once thought it was a reasonable decision made by a careful father. The man took the key, turned the lock, and went inside. The door closed behind them so softly that, if I hadn't been watching closely, I would have thought I imagined it. Elliot whispered, "The garage camera was turned off last night. Mom did it on the computer." I remembered then, the camera app on my phone had also gone strangely silent last night, but I had ignored it, assuming it was a network issue. I turned to look at my son. He knew about the garage because it was the only place Marianne allowed him to access when he needed to get his bike. Everything Elliot said linked together into a picture so clear, it was chilling. No sign of a break-in, no randomness. Everything unfolded according to a prearranged sequence. I placed my hand on Elliot's shoulder, feeling his body tense. "You did very well," I said softly. "Now we wait." The 2 men vanished inside the house. The lights stayed on. No loud noises, no chaos. That quiet was more frightening than any violent scene. I understood that in the most dangerous situations, silence is often the sign that everything is going exactly according to the mastermind's plan. I sat motionless, eyes never leaving the house. The decision not to go home had crossed the line from cautious choice to something else entirely. It had become the only way out for both father and son. And when the clock reached 10:20, I knew the worst had not even begun. At first, I didn't smell anything. I only noticed the light changing color through the windows. That came later, once everything had already erupted. What I saw first was how they moved inside my house. Through the living room window, shadows passed quickly, without hesitation, without searching. They knew exactly what needed to be done, where to go first, and where to stop next. To an outsider, they were just flickering silhouettes. To me, every step carried meaning. I had investigated serious industrial accidents before. I knew this. Accidents are chaotic, but staging follows order. These people were not acting randomly. I saw one of them crouch low, tilting a can of liquid and laying a long trail, tight along the base of the wall. The other followed behind, reinforcing key points, near the staircase, under the kitchen, beside the ventilation opening. No rushing, no excess. Every movement served one purpose only, to make the fire spread fast, leaving no chance to react. I looked up at the ceiling. There was no familiar blinking light from the smoke alarm system. In my mind surfaced the image of Elliot, once asking why the round box on the ceiling no longer lit up. I had told him the battery was weak. Now the answer was far clearer. The battery had been removed beforehand, in the absolute comfort of someone who believed their home was safe. The fire did not start from a single point. It ignited almost simultaneously in several places. Within seconds, the orange light swallowed the living room. The heat spread so fast that I saw the window glass tremble slightly before cracking. There was no alarm, no warning sound cutting through that terrifying silence. Elliot gripped my hand tightly. He didn't cry. His small body stiffened as if trying to memorize every detail. I could feel his breathing, short and rapid. I placed my hand on his head, but my eyes never left the house, being transformed into a structure of fire and smoke. "Dad," Elliot said very softly, as if afraid of breaking something. "Mom used to say, if there's a fire at night, you wouldn't wake up in time." The sentence cut straight to me, without needing explanation. I understood it better than anyone. At night, when the body is in deep rest, the first few minutes decide survival. With this method of arson, the time was nearly zero. Elliot paused, then continued, his voice so low I had to bend down to hear. "Mom said, if something happened, people would just think you had an accident. And me, they'd probably think I was asleep and didn't make it out in time." I felt my throat tighten. In that moment, the flames in front of me were no longer the greatest threat. What froze me was the clarity of a 9-year-old, placing himself in the position of being erased. He didn't speak with accusation. He simply stated a reality he had already understood on his own. Inside the house, the ceiling began to collapse. The fire spread upstairs exactly as I had seen in investigation reports. Fast, decisive, leaving no escape route. I knew that if we had been inside, if I hadn't listened to Elliot, everything would have ended within the first few minutes. The sound of fire truck sirens rose in the distance, late but still audible. Someone in the neighborhood must have called. The two men appeared again at the front door, stepping out like people who had just completed an assigned task. They didn't run. They got into their car, closed the doors, and drove away. Before the first red and blue lights swept across the scene, I pulled Elliot close. The fire reflected in his eyes, but what I saw more clearly was an understanding far too early of the value of life within a plan in which he had never been counted. That was the peak of life and death. And it was also the moment I realized that in this story, betrayal was not only meant to kill, it was also meant to erase the existence of a child who had believed he belonged there. The fire sirens tore a long line through the neighborhood as red and blue lights swept across familiar walls, illuminating every window frame and every neighbor gathered behind their curtains. The quiet street suddenly became a real crime scene. Police tape, hurried footsteps, water hissing as it slammed into heat. Elliot and I sat in the car, silent as shadows. My house was burning, half engulfed, smoke billowing thickly upward. The stench rode the wind where we were parked, clinging to the throat, making even swallowing feel raw. I knew the next moment would come. It was never a matter of if, only when. Marianne appeared less than 10 minutes later. A car screeched to a stop at the curb. A door flew open. She rushed out so fast her heel nearly slipped. Her coat hung off one shoulder, her hair loose from its usual neat tie. She ran toward the crowd at exactly the right speed for anyone watching to think genuine panic. "Nathan!" My name rang out above the spray of water and shouted commands. She collapsed at the edge of the police line, both hands covering her face. Her shoulders shook in a steady rhythm, the kind that makes people sympathize, believe, and overlook hard questions. I had seen this kind of crying before, not at funerals, but in ordinary life, when she needed an outcome, when she wanted someone to soften, when she needed to turn herself into the victim before anyone could ask why. Then she called Elliot's name. That voice came after, slower, quieter. It didn't stretch or break the way it did when she screamed my name. It sounded like a required line, spoken only to complete the picture of a good wife for the public eye. An officer stepped in to calm her. Marianne clutched his sleeve as if searching for support. She nodded repeatedly, speaking in fragments about the flight, about the call, about the fire, about the boy going to bed early. The words were arranged neatly, like a statement rehearsed in front of a mirror. Then a man in protective gear approached, his voice calm and clear. "At this time, we can't confirm whether anyone was inside the house when the fire started." In that instant, the performance cracked. Marianne snapped her head up, her eyes widened, pupils tightening. It wasn't the pain of someone who had just lost something precious, but the panic of someone hearing information that threatened to derail an entire plan. She stood too fast for a woman supposedly collapsing. Her hand clenched around her phone. I saw. Her thumb swipe across the screen again and again, as if calling, texting, checking something only she understood. She started talking faster, louder, trying to pull attention back to the gas accident story. My house. The system. My husband works in safety. Everything was designed carefully. She invoked my profession like a shield. If people believed it was a technical failure, the question of who poured the accelerant would never surface. But professionals aren't easily steered. I saw a firefighter subtly shake his head as he studied how the flames spread. I saw them point out multiple ignition points. I saw someone crouch near the door, sniffing, examining residue. Someone murmured just loud enough for Marianne to hear, "There's a possibility of arson." Her face drained of color. Her eyes swept the crowd, scanning over awnings and the dark gaps between houses, as if searching for something that shouldn't be there. She took half a step back, then froze, as if suddenly remembering she was standing in front of dozens of people. Elliot gently tugged my sleeve, his voice trembling but intact. "Mom's looking for Dad, right?" I looked at him through the rearview mirror. His eyes were wide, reflecting the firelight, but what hurt most was his clarity, a child who understood that looking here had nothing to do with love. I pulled out my phone on reflex. The screen lit up in my palm. A cruel thought flashed through my mind. Send just one message, see how she reacts. A quick test, like the wrist checks I used to run at work. My fingers moved across the keyboard, typed half a sentence, then stopped. I looked back at the crowd, at neighbors holding up cameras, at police documenting the scene, at Marianne acting and panicking at the same time. If I left a digital trace right now, I'd be stepping into the light. And once that happened, the one with the plan would immediately change it. I deleted the half-typed line. The screen went blank. After a short beat, I powered the phone off completely and shoved it deep into the console. From that moment on, I considered myself gone from her world. No signal, no trace, no path to follow. That was when I understood. Sometimes the most ethical thing for your child is the opposite of a husband's instinct. Not running toward, not confronting, not demanding explanations. I had to disappear for real, at least from every trail she could use to twist the story. Marianne was still there, trying to reassemble her grieving face. She bent down again, covering her mouth as if about to faint, but her eyes flicked rapidly toward the house, toward the police, toward the firefighters, toward anything that could ruin the narrative she was building. I pulled Elliot close, keeping him in the darkness of the car. "Dad?" he whispered. "Does Mom know she failed?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at Marianne one more time, at the way she cried and calculated, acted, and probed all at once. The answer was in the genuine fear in her eyes the moment she heard the words, "Can't confirm anyone was inside." "She knows," I said softly, "and from now on we have to be even quieter." We stayed still, watching the flames consume what used to be our home. In the flashing lights, I realized Marianne's true instinct had never been about saving anyone. It had always been about controlling the story, and I had just decided I would not give her that chance. I left the neighborhood while flames still clung to the scorched window frames. Elliot leaned back in the seat, eyes open but silent. He had seen too much in a single night. I didn't take him to the police station, and I didn't go back to anywhere familiar. I chose a different road, darker, with fewer cars. There was only one thought in my head. If I followed normal instinct now, everything would slip out of my control. I called Helena Brooks just after midnight. Her number had been saved for years, from a factory case where I had once been involved as a witness. Helena wasn't the kind of lawyer who appeared on billboards. She specialized in dirty files, where insurance money and death stood so close together that one misstep meant a trap. The phone rang twice before she answered. Her voice was hoarse, alert, without unnecessary questions. I spoke quickly, concise, stripped of emotion. House fire. Wife was at the airport. My son and I were not there. I suspected it was staged. Helena listened, then went silent for a few seconds. "Where are you now?" she asked. "My son and I are safe," I replied. "But if I report to the police right away, everything will turn into chaos." "You're right," Helena said. "Don't show up right now, and don't let your child be seen." I tightened my grip on the phone. "So what do we do?" "First, you need to understand your position," she said evenly. "On paper, you may already be dead." Helena began analyzing it like unfolding a map. Marianne had a plane ticket, airport cameras recording her check-in time. Someone had seen her in the departure area, an alibi clean enough to stand up to any initial questioning. The house burned at night. Homeowners are usually assumed to be asleep. Everything fit a simple story. "But my son," I said. "He was there." She knew he was there. Helena cut me off, not harshly but decisively. Legally, that's a detail she calculated for. The child isn't her biological son. If the initial report records that only you were in the house, all attention will focus on you. The rest will blur out. My stomach dropped. Elliot is my son from a previous relationship. On paper, Marianne is his stepmother. A detail I once thought only affected family emotions had now become a cold, legal factor. "She doesn't need to kill you," Helena said slowly, each word clear. "She needs the world to believe that you and the child who isn't hers disappeared." The sentence hung between us. I looked at Elliot in the rearview mirror. His eyes were closed, but his hand still clenched the seatbelt, as if letting go would make everything collapse. "What's the next step?" I asked. "We do the opposite of what innocent people usually do," Helena replied. "You don't appear. No crying in front of cameras. No explanations. I'll quietly gather the insurance files, financial history, recent changes. When she believes you're truly dead, she'll start making mistakes." "And my son?" "He's the most important witness," Helena said, "but not yet. Right now, your job is to protect him and stay silent." I hung up when the clock was nearing 1 a.m. The road was empty. Yellow streetlights spilled onto the wet pavement, stretching distorted shadows. I slowed the car, looking for a temporary refuge for the first night of my new life, where I was dead on paper. I realized I was doing something I used to condemn in ethics training sessions, delaying the truth to control the outcome. But if there was ever a time to go against the righteous path, this was it. Because if I stepped into the light too soon, the only one who would pay the price was the child sleeping in the back seat. From the moment Helena called me the dead man, the investigation had begun, not with sirens or police tape, but with calculated silence. And I understood that silence would last until the woman grew confident enough to take one step too far. I remembered the car on the morning of the third day after the fire. The thought came slowly, like a misplaced puzzle piece finally surfacing. Marianne had gone on a business trip. She had gone to the airport. But from that day until now, no one had mentioned the car leaving the long-term parking lot. In every call, every initial report, they spoke only about the burned house and the husband who was no longer there. The car was forgotten as if it had nothing to do with it. I spoke to Helena that same afternoon. She wasn't surprised. She asked only one concise question. "Whose name is the car registered under?" I answered immediately. I signed the purchase contract 3 years ago. Marianne was listed as the co-financial signer because it was convenient for tax records at the time. A Toyota RAV4, model, year 2021, silver gray. I still kept a spare key on me, hanging together with my own car key since the day we bought it, in case one of us ever misplaced the other. Helena nodded. "That's enough," she said. "Legally, you have the right to open it, especially since the vehicle is directly related to the insurance file of someone considered deceased. I didn't go to the airport alone. Helena came with me, along with a parking lot security employee as a witness. Everything happened in daylight, under cameras, unhurried. I didn't want any questions later about how the car had been accessed. The RAV4 sat in the long-term parking area in the exact spot Marianne had written in the company's shared work calendar. A thin layer of dust covered the body, enough to show it had been standing still for many days. There were no signs anyone had touched it. That feeling sent a chill through me. The overconfidence of someone who believed every link in the chain was exactly where it should be. I used the spare key to unlock the door. The sound of the lock clicking was familiar, smooth, not forced. I opened the trunk, then checked the back seat. Nothing unusual beyond a few water bottles and a light jacket. Everything looked like the car of a busy woman, always prepared for short trips, until I bent down to check the side compartment by the driver's seat. There was a phone there, not the one Marianne used every day. A different model, plain black, no case, no scratches. Placed snug against the side of the car, hidden just enough to escape a casual glance, yet positioned to be grabbed in a single second. It wasn't forgotten. It was there because someone wanted it there. I picked up the phone. It had battery, no screen lock, as if the person who used it was certain no one else would ever touch it. I opened the unfamiliar phone inside the car with a feeling unlike anything I had experienced before. No nervous anticipation, no trembling hands, just a hollow state, like reading medical test results when you already expect the worst. The phone wasn't locked, no password, a dangerous confidence, or simply the habit of someone who believes they control everything. The message list appeared immediately at the top of the screen. No affectionate names, just single letters like J, sometimes Coach. I scrolled upward. The content didn't begin with the usual clumsy secrecy. No blatant longing. No familiar complaints of an impulsive affair. They were talking about plans. The man was a yoga instructor. I realized it through fragmented conversations about class schedules, studio spaces, and weekend retreats. His tone was calm, like someone advising a student, rather than speaking to a lover. Marianne replied in short, precise sentences, stripped of excess emotion. They didn't talk about running away. They talked about after everything is done. The messages appeared line by line, like an instruction manual. Stage the fire to resemble a gas leak. Mark the points of impact. Hire 2 people experienced in this kind of work. Keep the scene clean. Leave no crude traces. One detail was repeated multiple times. Marianne had to be at the airport at the exact time window, in the waiting area, in front of cameras. Ticket purchased. Boarding pass scanned. The alibi had to be clear enough that no one would question it at the beginning. Interspersed among those cold lines were sentences about freedom, about a lighter life, about no longer having to play the role of the perfect wife in a marriage she called mind-numbingly dull. There were mentions that the two of them had no children together, no bindings, no fixed schedules. One sentence made me pause longer than the rest. I don't want to keep living with the feeling that I'm raising someone else's life. Someone else's life. I knew exactly who she meant. Helena sat beside me, not looking at the screen. She let me read everything. When I put the phone down, she then picked it up and opened the data already stored on the device found in the car. The phone contained multiple work files downloaded beforehand, saved locally, requiring no additional login. Helena backed up all the data, recording the time, the device, and the witnesses present. A spreadsheet file opened. The numbers appeared neat and cold, not love letters. A spreadsheet. The columns were aligned, titles clearly labeled. The first column, costs of raising a non-biological child, by year. There were rows for psychological therapy, rows for education, even a carefully noted category labeled behavioral risk. No lengthy explanation, just numbers increasing with age. The next column calculated reputational loss if a divorce occurred, measured in professional impact, in contracts potentially lost, in personal credibility. Everything was converted. The third column was insurance money, $500,000. The activation date circled, payout conditions highlighted in green. The final column listed the house value, $1.2 million. Notes about ownership transfer, about selling after a sufficiently cooling period. On the far right edge of the sheet, small, sharp text read, optimal scenario. I didn't collapse. I didn't rage. The feeling arrived much slower than I expected, like a dull ache beginning with the realization that everything I had ever considered human between us was merely a variable in an equation. I wasn't betrayed because she loved someone else. I was shattered by the fact that my son had been placed into a balance sheet as a long-term expense. Elliot was not a child in Marianne's eyes. He was a line item, a risk to be managed in order to optimize her life. I sat there watching the numbers flicker on the screen, and for the first time understood the true motive. Not jealousy, not impulse. It was low morality risk management, choosing the path that delivered the most freedom, the least entanglement, the fastest resolution. Elliot had been standing behind me for some time. I hadn't heard his footsteps, perhaps because he had long learned how to walk quietly in that house. "Dad," he asked, his voice so small it nearly dissolved into the air. "Am I a mistake?" The question carried no accusation. It was asked the way one asks about the weather, or about something thought over for a very long time before finally being spoken. I turned and pulled him tight against my chest. I wanted to say so much, to cover him with reassurance. But in that moment, the only thing I could do was hold him as tightly as possible, as a way of affirming that some things must never be subjected to calculation. The moral peak of this story is not the fire. It lies in the moment an adult sat down, opened a spreadsheet, and decided that a child was not worth keeping in her life plan. And from that moment on, I knew every step I took next would no longer be just about seeking justice for myself. I was fighting for the right to exist of a child who once believed that place had been home. Yet that afternoon at the law office, Detective Tom Wilson was invited in. He was in his early 50s, spoke little, listened more. He reviewed the messages, studied the house fire plan diagram described in the chat, examined the cost spreadsheet and the words optimal scenario in the corner of the file. He nodded a few times, but his expression never changed. "The motive is there," he said. "The plan is there. The messages are there." I waited for what came next. "But it's still not enough," he explained bluntly. Marianne was at the airport at exactly the time of the fire. Security cameras clearly captured her face, the timestamps, the departure gate. The phone found in the car could be claimed to have been planted by someone else. Her lawyer could easily argue it was not her property, that someone deliberately framed her after I died. There's no direct confession, he concluded. If this goes to court now, she still has a way out. Listening to him, I felt an emptiness open up in my chest. Everything I thought was sufficient turned out to be only enough to raise suspicion. Helena sat beside me, silent, but I knew she was already weighing the next move. The detective was the one who broke the silence. He leaned back in his chair, looked at me for a long moment, then said slowly, "If you want to catch someone smart, don't push them into a corner too early. Let them believe they've already won." I looked up. "When someone thinks it's all over," he continued, "they start enjoying their victory, and that's when they talk more honestly, more carelessly." Helena nodded. She turned to me, her eyes clearer than any explanation. The plan was not force and not confrontation. The plan was to give Marianne a false sense of security, long enough for her to dismantle her own defenses. "You have to disappear completely," Helena said. "No news, no reaction, no sign that you still exist." I thought of Elliot, thought of how silence meant letting my child continue living in uncertainty. But I also understood that if I rushed, the one who would pay first would be my child. I nodded, not because I was ready, but because I had no other choice. The trap was sketched right there in that room. No diagrams on a whiteboard, no dramatic words. Just a very ordinary sequence of actions. Wait, stay silent, and let the other side confidently take one more step. I left the office after nightfall. Outside, everything went on as usual. People heading home from work, cars lining up, life completely unaware that somewhere a story was being pushed into a more dangerous phase. From that moment on, I knew the game was no longer about the evidence in my hands, but about whether I had the patience to wait for Marianne to believe she had escaped. And once she believed that, the truth would find its own way out. The call reached Marianne late in the morning while she was staying at a temporary rental near downtown. The voice on the other end introduced himself briefly, a fire investigator coordinating with the insurance department. The tone was calm, professional, the kind used by people accustomed to discussing consequences rather than emotions. They said the case file was nearing its final stage. There were a few details that needed to be discussed in person to complete the payout procedure. They mentioned that the remains recovered were severely damaged, difficult to identify by sight. DNA testing and dental records would still be required, but the payout process could be prepared in advance if the wife signed a commitment. There were several documents that needed to be signed before the funds could be released. There were no condolences, none were necessary. At this stage, everything was spoken in technical terms. Marianne listened, paused for a few beats, then replied concisely. She asked for the appointment time, the location, how long it would take. Not a single question about the caller's identity. The speed with which she agreed made it clear that, in her mind, the story was already over. After hanging up, Marianne sat still for a moment. What she felt was neither fear nor confusion. It was the relief of someone who believed they had passed the hardest part. Her husband was dead on paper. The house had burned to ash. The investigation file was being closed, layer by layer. The insurance money was about to be transferred. The future she had envisioned in those secret messages was now waiting on nothing more than a signature. I arrived 15 minutes early. The cafe sat right near the downtown area, the kind of place that was always packed on weekends. The coffee grinders shrieked and burst, the smell of espresso mixed with freshly baked pastries. Chairs scraped against the floor. Drink orders overlapped without pause. Outside, it was the kind of early-season Boston cold, drafts slipping through the door every time someone walked in. I chose the table by the window exactly where Detective Tom Wilson had told me to sit. The light there was bright enough to clearly see the face across from me. Yet there was still a blind angle so I wouldn't draw too much attention. A tiny microphone, no bigger than a bean, was taped snugly inside my thick gray coat. The wire ran neatly down my collar, the earpiece buried deep in my left ear. I'd worked in security long enough to understand one thing: the smaller the device, the bigger the consequences. Just let her talk, Wilson's voice murmured softly in my ear. Ask open-ended questions. Stay calm. Don't push. People slip when they think they're in control. I swallowed hard. My hand rested on the rim of the hot coffee cup, the warmth only enough to keep my palm from going numb, not enough to ease my chest. Elliot wasn't with me. I'd sent my son somewhere safe, exactly as Helena Brooks had instructed. The kid had already seen too much, heard too much. I wasn't dragging him into one more scene. I scanned the cafe on reflex. The barista behind the counter looked like a regular morning shift worker, but the way he checked the clock and glanced at the door was very professional. A man sat near an outlet with a laptop open and earbuds in, but his eyes weren't on the screen. A couple sat close to the wall, hands around their teacups as if chatting, yet their shoulders were always angled slightly toward my table. Near the entrance, someone in a black coat sat alone, a newspaper spread out in front of him that he barely turned. All of them were Wilson's people. None of them looked at me for long. They didn't look at each other either. They were just there, like part of an ordinary Saturday morning. 9:58. I took a long breath in, then let it out, slowly. My heart still refused to cooperate. I was afraid of one very simple thing. If I shook too obviously, Marianne would smell it. She lived by reading other people's emotions. I had lived with her. I knew. 10:02. The small wind chime hanging on the door rattled. The door opened, a rush of cold spilled in, and Marianne walked inside. She was dressed neatly, just polished enough that strangers would think she was a respectable working woman. A long coat, hair tied back, light makeup. There was no sign of someone who had just suffered a loss. Instead, there was a subtle relief, like someone who had passed through something unpleasant and was now standing in front of what she'd been waiting for all along. I saw it more clearly than anything else, satisfaction hidden beneath politeness. Marianne paused by the door for a few seconds, her eyes sweeping the cafe. She was looking for someone. Not me. I knew that. She was looking for the fire investigator or the insurance representative the phone call had invented to lure her out of her safe zone. She scanned one more time, then her gaze hit me. Everything on Marianne's face slammed to a stop. The thin smile vanished. Her steps faltered where she stood. Her lips parted, but it took a beat before any sound came out. That's impossible. The next sentence slipped out faster than her control could catch it. You're still alive? I didn't stand. I didn't wave. I just sat there, staring straight at her the way you look at a stranger wearing the exact face of the woman you once called your wife. Marianne walked toward me slowly, as if moving through cold water. She pulled out the chair and sat down, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Her fingertips trembled slightly, but the rest of her body worked hard to maintain a neat, proper posture. I let the silence stretch just long enough. Not long enough to draw attention, just long enough for her to hear her own breathing. Then I asked, my voice low, each word clear, "Are you disappointed?" Marianne blinked. Her jaw tightened. I didn't stop there. "Or just surprised that your plan didn't make it to the final act?" She swallowed. Her throat moved visibly. Her eyes flicked quickly toward the door, then the counter, as if searching for a reasonable exit. What are you doing here, Nathan?" Marianne asked, forcing her voice back toward normal. It sounded like small talk, but the breath underneath the words was off. I leaned forward slightly, not enough to attract attention from nearby tables, but enough for her to understand I wasn't here to beg. "I know you're having an affair. I also know you thought I was dead." Marianne opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand lightly, the gesture of someone who had already decided not to argue. I know about the phone in your car, I continued. The one I'd never seen in the house. The messages are still there. Marianne's eyes darkened. The look was fast, but I caught it. A spike of panic shoved deep down. I went on, my tone even, like I was reading an incident report. I know Elliot heard the call the night before. He heard the time, the name. He heard the part about after 10 o'clock. Hearing my son's name made Marianne's shoulders twitch, very slightly, but enough to give her away. She didn't like that name entering the story, not like this. I looked straight at her, and I sat across from our house and watched the two of you use a key to enter the garage. I saw how you moved inside, step by step. I saw the fire break out in multiple places. The coffee in front of Marianne was still steaming. She didn't touch it. Her hand shifted from the table edge to gripping the strap of her bag. Marianne tried to smile, a smile so strained the corners of her mouth couldn't keep up with her eyes. "What are you talking about, Nathan?" she asked. "You're traumatized. You're imagining things. The fire was an accident. I was at the airport. There are cameras. People saw me." She threw out that last sentence like a shield, reminding herself she still had a way out. I nodded very slightly, as if agreeing with part of the truth. "I know you have an alibi at the airport," I said, "and that's exactly why you chose it." Marianne stiffened. A muscle in her face twitched, then was quickly pulled back into place. She was slipping back into her role, but the role already had a tear in it. I kept my voice calm, kept the scene quiet. "I didn't call you here to fight. I called you here because I want to hear you talk." Marianne stared at me. In her eyes, the initial shock was shifting into defense. She started looking for ways to bend the story, weighing which words would serve her best. And that was exactly what Wilson wanted. In my ear, his voice came softly, steady as a clock's second hand. "That's it. Keep that rhythm. Let her believe she's still controlling the conversation." I watched Marianne, watched how she tried to keep her voice even, tried to keep her hands still, tried to keep the face of an innocent wife. But beneath it, a crack was spreading. She had walked into this cafe expecting to sign off on a payout and close a chapter of her life. Now she was sitting across from a man who was supposed to be Ash, and I knew that from this moment on, every word she spoke would decide whether she left the cafe on her own feet or in handcuffs. I didn't argue. I laid the truth on the table, piece by piece, forcing her to step over it herself. I opened my jacket pocket and took out a stack of papers that had already been neatly folded. I didn't throw them. I didn't shove them forward. I slid them across the table, letting the edge of the paper lightly touch Marianne's coffee cup. "I found this in your car at Logan," I said. "The phone I've never seen inside the house." Marianne lowered her gaze, just for a split second. Then she looked up quickly, the reflex of someone used to hiding things. "You violated my privacy," she said, sharp but not loud yet. "You had no right—" "I have a spare key," I cut in, my voice still even. "The car is jointly owned, and that phone hadn't been turned off yet." I pointed to the first page, a screenshot of a text exchange. The words were so tender they felt out of place in the noisy cafe. Checking in about morning training, compliments about her body, discreet arrangements to meet. "Coach J," I read slowly. Marianne pressed her lips together. Her eyes shifted from resistance to alertness. I slid over the next page. The tone was no longer affectionate, short, blunt, full of coded meaning. "Mark this spot. Make it look like a gas leak. Those two have done this before. You need to be at the airport on time. The cameras will handle the rest." No one in the cafe could hear me, but I clearly saw Marianne's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. "You made this up," she said, faster this time. "That phone could belong to anyone. You took it from my car and fabricated everything." I nodded, as if partially agreeing. "I figured you'd say that, so I printed this too." I slid over another page. On it was a number. 500,000, your life insurance policy. Then the next page. 1.2 million, I continued, the value of the house. Marianne stared at the figures longer this time. I saw the corner of her mouth twitch slightly, the way it does when someone touches exactly what they don't want touched. "You don't understand," she blurted, her tone shifting. "You don't live in this marriage like I do." That was when she changed roles, from cornered to self-pitying. "You're always gone," Marianne said, not looking at me. "Trip after trip, I'm alone in that house. A big, empty house. You think making money is enough?" She scoffed, but the sound was dry. "We don't have children together," she went on. "Do you know what that feels like? Watching friends have babies, then coming home to raise someone else's child." She glanced at me, her eyes sharp. "I lost my freedom, lost my youth, lost my professional image if I divorce, and if I stay, it's like living in hell." I didn't interrupt. I let her push herself further. "Coach Jay makes me feel seen," Marianne said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Alive, like I can breathe. And Elliot—" My son's name fell onto the table like a heavy object. Marianne went quiet for a beat. Then she exhaled, as if exhausted from holding up an image for too long. "You always bring the boy into this," she said. "I tried. That wasn't enough. I needed one more slide. What did you call him in the plan? An expense?" Marianne's eyes darkened. This time she didn't immediately deny it. "Raising a child that isn't mine disgusts me," she replied, her voice turning cold. "Therapy, school, behavioral risk, all of it is a long-term burden." Something collapsed in my chest, but I kept my face still. "So what do you want?" I asked. The open question exactly as Wilson had instructed. "You want me gone so you can get your life back?" Marianne looked up at me. There was no trace of her earlier pretense left in her eyes. Only fatigue mixed with irritation, the look of someone who thinks she's being forced to explain an obvious decision. "I just need you gone," she said quicker than necessary. "Everything else will sort itself out." She paused, then added, as if correcting herself. "The boy—" She stopped for half a beat, searching for a word. He was just an unplanned complication. My ears rang in that moment, but I kept my expression neutral. Wilson had warned me. Let her talk it all out. "I never wanted to hurt him," Marianne added, as if justifying herself. "But every plan has a margin of error." I didn't argue. I truly didn't understand anymore. Marianne curled her lips into a thin, joyless smile. The spare key kept in the box outside the garage. I tipped them off so they knew where to look. She tilted her head as if recalling a familiar routine. The garage camera was shut off the night before, just a few clicks. I heard the faint tapping of a pen from the bar. Someone was recording every word. "Stage the scene. Gas leak. Mark the right spot. Under the kitchen near the stairs. Make the fire spread fast." She spoke as if describing a completed project, without emotion, without hesitation. I was at the airport, the lounge, clear camera footage, right time, frame. She stopped and looked at me, as if waiting for praise for how tight it all was. I slammed my hand on the table and said, "Enough." Marianne frowned, as if she didn't understand yet. At that moment, the chair beside us shifted. The man with the laptop stood up. The barista took off their apron. The couple by the window turned at the same time. Wilson stepped out from behind, badge held level with his chest. "Marianne," he said firmly, "you are under arrest." She jumped up too fast, the chair crashing backward. "A setup!" Marianne screamed, her voice breaking. "You set me up." Wilson didn't raise his voice. "You just said what we needed to hear," he replied. "In your own words." The handcuffs snapped shut with a dry, metallic sound. Marianne looked back at me one last time, her eyes no longer calculating, only belated shock. She was led out of the cafe amid stunned stares. No one spoke. Only the espresso machine resumed its noise, as if everything were trying to return to normal. I stayed seated. My hands were still shaking, but I knew one thing clearly. The trap had closed. Immediately after Marianne was arrested, an emergency meeting was convened that very afternoon. A small room, white lights, the the smell of cold coffee lingering on the table. Helena sat across from me. Wilson leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. "The file is strong," Helena said bluntly, "but it's not airtight." She looked straight at me, no beating around the bush. "The other side's lawyers will argue Marianne was emotionally unstable. They'll latch on to the fact that you unlocked the car yourself, that the phone could have been tampered with, and that the airport video footage still exists." Wilson nodded. "That alibi isn't dead yet. To shut it down completely, we need someone to step up and connect the pieces." I knew immediately who that was. "The yoga instructor," I said. Wilson studied me for a moment longer. "You'll meet him." No one asked whether I wanted to or not. The story had reached the point where it had to be done. Helena laid out the plan clearly. I would be the one to knock on the door. I wouldn't threaten him. I would only bring the truth, arranged in the correct order. The meeting took place the following night at a small studio rented by the hour. No big sign. No one would ever think the place was connected to a criminal case. He arrived a few minutes late, in workout clothes, a towel around his neck, his expression wary. "Marianne has been arrested," I said as soon as he sat down. He froze. I didn't let the silence stretch too long. "She named you as the one behind it. Said you planned everything. You hired the people. You coordinated it." He opened his mouth to object, but I raised my hand and turned on my phone. The recording from the cafe played. Marianne's voice, cold and clear. The lines about me needing to disappear. About a margin of error. About how to do it. His face drained of color. "I still have all the messages," I continued, "including the cash withdrawal timestamps, including the deposit for the two professionals." He lowered his head, his hands clasped together. Sweat beaded at his temples. "You thought you were just on the sidelines," I said slowly. "But in this file, the one who came up with the idea is you." The door opened. Wilson walked in along with another investigator. No noise. No rush. "You have two choices," Wilson said. "Cooperate, tell the truth, and let the court consider the extent of your involvement. Or stay silent and let everything fall on your head." No one pressed him further. The man in front of me collapsed quickly. No tears, just a heavy sigh, as if the weight had slid off his shoulders in the worst possible way. "I'll talk," he said. "I don't want to carry it all." He gave up the two men who were hired, explained how the key was passed through the lockbox outside the garage. Then came the part he had avoided the longest. He admitted he was drowning in gambling debt, trapped in loan shark pressure, squeezed every day. During that time, he met Marianne, a lonely woman stuck in a cold marriage, burdened with responsibility for a child who was not her own. Two people who saw in each other the same escape. My insurance money, the house, and a death staged as an accident became their shared solution. According to him, it was a plan for both of them to be free. He would escape his debts. She would escape the life she had long despised. Everything fit. 2 days later, the police arrested the remaining two. Evidence was recovered. Transaction cameras were pulled. Movement routes were matched down to each time slot. When Helena placed the new stack of files on the table, she said only one short sentence. "Now they have no way out." I looked at the pile of paper growing thicker by the day. For the first time since the night of the fire, I felt the balance had shifted. It was no longer word against word. There was only a chain of people, actions and traces linked together, leaving no gaps to escape. The trial opened on a gray morning. The air in the courtroom was heavy, as if everyone understood this was no longer the story of a broken marriage, but the consequence of a chain of cold, deliberate choices. The defense began in the familiar way, focusing on the airport video, pressing the possibility of a setup, raising questions about the unfamiliar phone. They spoke calmly, trying to construct reasonable doubt. The prosecution did not argue emotionally. Each piece was placed on the table in proper order. The audio recording from the cafe was played again, the voices clear and coherent. unedited. The message thread appeared on the screen, matching timestamps, matching wording. Call records were cross-checked against travel logs. The yoga instructor stepped onto the witness stand, his face turning ashen. He confirmed his role, admitted that financial motive and fear of debt had drawn him into an agreement with Marianne. The two arsonists followed, describing how they received instructions, the sabotage location, the cash paid in advance. Each testimony gradually sealed the remaining gaps. The verdict was delivered after many days of argument. Marianne was sentenced to 30 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and organized insurance fraud. The judge emphasized that this was a calculated plan, prepared over time, and that placing a child in danger as an acceptable variable was especially egregious. The yoga instructor received 12 years in prison as a principal accomplice. The sentence was reduced due to cooperation with investigators, but the court made clear that his financial motive and proactive role in proposing the plan meant he could not be viewed as someone merely led astray. The two individuals who directly set the fire each received 15 years in prison, along with full restitution for all fire-related damages and emergency response costs. Their records noted professional conduct and organized repeat offending. The gavel came down. The courtroom fell silent. There were no cheers, only the end of a chain of lies. After that came quiet months. I refused to turn the insurance money into something meant to numb pain. Part of the payout was dedicated to Elliot's long-term therapy, so the boy could learn to sleep peacefully again, learn to trust that home is a safe place. Part was transferred to a fund supporting victims of arson. The remainder was used to build a simpler life, a single-story house, a sufficient security system, a stable daily rhythm. I changed jobs, leaving constant travel behind to work in safety training. The new work was less glamorous, but it allowed me to be present when it mattered. In the evenings, I was home when Elliot needed to tell stories about school. On weekends, we fixed up an old bicycle together. Small things, but they pulled him back into childhood step by step. The lesson came late but clear. Do not use the appearance of a normal family to drown out a child's cry. True victory is not the rush of satisfaction, but keeping your child alive, keeping the truth standing, and letting light reach the place where it was once forced into darkness. Everything is over, but the marks remain, not in the courthouse and not in the sentences that have already closed, but in how we live each day afterward. Elliot sleeps more peacefully now. The nighttime startles are fewer. He smiles more, talks more, and begins to believe that this world still has a safe place for him. I relearn how to be a father in the simplest sense. Be present, listen, and believe my child the first time. If this story made you think, leave a comment. If you found it useful, share it with others. And if you want to hear more true stories about family, truth, and how people stand back up after devastation, subscribe to the channel. You never know. Someone out there may need to hear exactly this story.